My mother developed asthma at the same time as I did, or at least another thing she was extremely vague about. Her accounts changed over the years, but sometimes she said when I was about 18 months old, other times she said about the same time as me, which would have been post my supposed polio and pneumonia, when I was about 3. So we were both asthmatic, which did lend some credence, I have to say, to the death certificate which announced that my mother had died of asthma. If only the doctor had taken the trouble to see her body, or even if my father had taken the trouble to call a doctor while my mother was dying. In point of fact, the doctor cannot possibly have seen her body, because, as I've already said, she had been in the funeral parlour for at least 24 hours by the time the doctor signed it, so she never saw the body. And as I've also said, there was no post-mortem. And as I've also said, there was a blood-stained cushion, stream of blood from the corner of her mouth. All consistent with lung trauma, not asthma. But so, nevertheless, she did have asthma. It was a much milder form than mine. Much, much milder. I mean, my attacks would last 8 hours. The worst lasted 12 hours. And there was no relief for me. She, on the other hand, had a dry bargain inhaler, which seemed to give her instant relief. Anyway, we developed it at roughly the same time. I always know what I'm going to say, and then I begin to lose my thread lately. Clearly, something major happened. I think for a start, my father abducted my brother and took him away from Australia, leaving my mother behind. Well, that would have been a pretty sharp wake-up call to her, that as he was named as the father of Michael on the birth certificate, there was nothing at all to stop my father taking him. I think that would have given her the fright of her life. She adored my brother. I use that word a lot, but there was a lot of adoration going around in our family, which disguised extremely well the abuse that was also going around in my family. So when she got back to England, obviously she located my father and brother and got them back. Whether she wanted my father back by then is a very moot point. I wouldn't. If my husband had stolen my child away from me, well, and he wasn't a husband, he was a partner, but whatever he was, I wouldn't be able to forgive that. Then, in that year of 1953, when he returned, his wife Enid, who had actually divorced in the previous year, 1952. I think I'd said 1956 earlier, because that was the year he gave me. But it wasn't, it was 52. So they were divorced. It may well be that he told me the truth when he said he didn't know she divorced him at first, but I think he found out fairly fast. And funnily enough, that year that he returned, 53, Enid got pregnant. She'd lived with Thomas Montgomery by that time for 5 years and not got pregnant. You could argue that she'd only divorced the year before, and from that time onwards was free to try for a baby. You could argue that. And in that same year of 53, my mother apparently got pregnant. So close together that I said over. Enid's son Colin was born on paper 44 days before me. On paper. So I am clear in my mind, as clear as I can ever be, that the babies were swapped. That Enid got Colin and my mother got me. Not wanted. Or Colin died at birth and neither of them got him for very long. Then came this. I do think now that this is where MK Ultra came into my life. I most certainly was in an isolation hospital. That there's no doubt of. I remember very weird things. The memory of the girl coughing blood into a cup was nothing. Absolutely nothing. I remember far weirder things. That was nothing weird. She had TB. I remember being stood, apparently aged 2.5, astride an adult toilet. 1 foot planted either side. I was naked, and I was expected to urinate. Well, I couldn't. I suppose it was a psychological block, even at that young age. It wasn't the position I was used to peeing in. Well, accuse me of really going off. I mean, the whole thing is fanciful, isn't it? What if that had been some kind of porno video for paedophiles? There are people who get off on watching people urinate, and presumably people who get off on watching children urinate. Well, it couldn't have been clearer if I'd succeeded, could it? Standing on astride an adult loo. Very clear memory because I was so angry when I didn't succeed, so very, very angry. Another memory that involves an enormous bath. I presume it was an adult bath, but of course it would look enormous to a kid of 2.5. But it seemed even bigger than any adult bath. So I think that was only the start, really, of isolation. Not just for me, but for my mother. Because when I was 4, we moved to a farmhouse on the outskirts of Southampton. It'd be hard to picture now, given where it is now. But there was nothing around that farmhouse except for orchards and trees, lanes, hedgerows. It was there on its own. The nearest. It was called Lower Townhill Farm. Upper Townhill Farm was a fair distance away. Well, 5 or 10 minute walk. Cutbush Lane. My grandmother used to call it Cutthroat Lane. But the theme of isolation continued because my brother went off to his boys' school as my father insisted. My father was God knows where most of the time. And my mother and I were there on our own in that farmhouse. They then moved, when it was built, into 21 Forest Hills Drive, the split-level house. And again, the isolation continued. No friends, no neighbours. I've said it again and again. I think this was about the change in my mother and about isolation.